And this session is titled Building an Inclusive Future, Gender and Intergenerational Equity. As we all know, the climate crisis disproportionately youth-led and indigenous community-driven climate innovations and explore financial mechanisms that ensure equitable access for vulnerable groups. To guide us through this important discussion, please join me in welcoming our moderator of the session, Ms. Sumnima Udas, the founder and executive director of the Lumbini Museum Initiative, working to establish a world-class museum at the birthplace of Gautam Buddha that will enrich visitors' experiences and uplift local communities. Before this, she spent 15 years as an award-winning international journalist with the CNN International, reporting from key hubs like New Delhi, Hong Kong, and New York. Without further ado, join me in welcoming our moderator, Ms. Sumnima Udas, with a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always very, very difficult to moderate anything after lunch, but we will try our best to keep everyone awake. Namaste again. My name is Sumnima Udas, and while I'm working on a museum, I think the real reason I'm here today is because I've been a journalist for many years, for 15 years for CNN, and I will try my best to moderate this in the best way I can. While we wait for more of the audience to show up after lunch, maybe I will begin by calling our esteemed panelists one by one. We'll begin with the Deputy Director General of ICIMOD, Isabella Cochel. Patricia Fernandez Pacheco, Country Representative of UN Women in Nepal. Mr. Jaibal Naduvat, Vice President and Senior Fellow of a leading think tank in India, Observer Research Foundation, or ORF. And last but not least, Abdus Mia, Youth Leader, heading disaster management and relief for one of the ruling parties. And of course, our keynote speaker, Ms. Bandana Rana, who needs no introduction. I will give her bio shortly once we begin. So again, it is truly an honor for me to be able to moderate this what I think is a very important session on building an inclusive future, gender, and intergenerational equity. One of the main objectives of the Sagarmatha Sambaad is to discuss climate change, climate justice for countries like Nepal, who contribute very little to global emissions and yet bear the heaviest burdens. But in this session, we want to take this discourse of climate justice just one step further. Because climate justice is not just about fostering cooperation, building solidarity, or even climate finance. It is about building a truly inclusive future, which means taking into account the reality of what women, children, youth, elderly, people with disabilities, people from marginalized communities, what all of these communities face every single day due to climate change. In this session, we would like to go beyond the rhetoric and articulate exactly what it is that we are dealing with and what it is that we would want. There is enough data to show that women and girls of this region are disproportionately affected. Globally, 80% of those displaced by climate change are women. Children and youth, who have contributed virtually nothing to global emissions, are seeing their futures jeopardized. The elderly, people with disabilities, face tremendous challenges in time of disaster. And let's not forget the indigenous communities and marginalized caste community groups, often living in rural and high-altitude, climate-vulnerable areas, yet excluded from those important decisions that affect their land, their water, their survival. Despite possessing deep ecological knowledge and traditions of sustainable living, their voices remain on the margins. All of this is happening, of course, in regions already strained by poverty, by weak infrastructure, and limited access to financial mechanisms. This reality, that those who are least responsible for the crisis are the most impacted is not just a tragedy, it is injustice, and we have been hearing it over and over again in several other sessions as well. So today's panel gives us an opportunity to reflect on three main questions. How do we ensure that climate adaptation strategies in Nepal and the Global South are inclusive and our voices are heard? How can we channel those resources and decision-making power to local and vulnerable communities? And how do we narrow that gap between policy and practice? How do we build the political will to close that gap? I hope this discussion will help us move beyond generalizations and towards actions. And without taking any more of your time, it is my honor to call upon the keynote speaker of this session, Ms. Bandana Rana, to give us an overview of the issues at hand. Ms. Bandana Rana she needs no introduction in this field. She's a key leader of the women's movement in Nepal. She brings more than 3 decades of experience promoting women's rights and gender equality. She has led advocacy programs linking United Nations frameworks provided by the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and is a current member and former vice chair of CEDAW. Thank you very much.
Namaste and warm greetings, honorable members of parliament, if they are here, because they said they would be here, distinguished delegates, friends, participants. It is a profound honor for me to be able to speak in this session from the heart of Himalayas, Sagarmatha, a towering symbol of resilience and reverence, of ecological wisdom and spirituality. Spirituality has been the key word since yesterday. I think most of the speakers have been using that word. As we gather here for this global dialogue, Sagarmatha Sambaad, I humbly invite us all into a moment of collective contemplation and shared reflection on building an inclusive future, gender and intergenerational equity. We are not here just to speak about the climate. We are here to speak about people, especially those most affected, least heard, and yet most vital to our survival: women and girls, youth, and indigenous communities. We are here to explore how justice, gender justice, intergenerational justice, and climate justice must become the heartbeat of our response to the global crisis. And with Sagarmatha as a guiding summit, let us reimagine the future we are shaping for our daughters, sons, and our grandchildren, and for the rivers, forests, and snow-covered peaks that sustain us all. Our mountains are more than majestic landscapes. They are the world's water towers, biodiversity hotspots, and homes to millions. But they are also cultural and spiritual anchors. They teach us humility, patience, and responsibility. But what happens when the glaciers melt, when landslides wash away homes, when biodiversity is lost, and with it, entire ways of life? The answers are not only in technology. They are in solidarity, in systems change, in reimagining power so that mountain communities are not treated as afterthoughts in climate policies, but as central architects of a just future. Climate change, we are all aware, is not just a technical and environmental problem. It is a deeply human one, and like all human challenges, it is layered with inequalities. Women, especially those in rural and mountainous regions, often bear the heaviest brunt of climate impacts. In Nepal and across South Asia, they are the first to feel the scarcity of water, the loss of forest resources, the decline of agricultural productivity, and the disasters that disrupt their homes and communities. In many villages, it is women who walk longer distances for water. It is mothers who stay behind to care for the elderly and the children when men migrate due to climate-induced livelihood loss. It is girls who drop out of school when floods destroy infrastructure or family resources dwindle. 80% of people displaced by climate change globally are women. In the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, Temperatures are rising at a rate faster than the global average, and glacier retreat is accelerating. The consequences are devastating, and melting glaciers are destabilizing water cycles and threatening over 240 million people in the region. Yet, despite these challenges, women are not just victims. We are honored to have our Honorable Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Arzu Rana Deuba. Welcome to this session. And I know this is a subject very dear to her heart, and she's a professional working in this for many, many years. Yet, despite these challenges, women are not just victims. They are also agents of change. They carry ancestral knowledge of seed saving, water management, and forest conservation. They are already leading local climate solutions, often with minimal recognition or support. And now, let me turn to the youth, the torchbearers for tomorrow, those whose future hangs in the balance, but who are also leading the change with courage and creativity. Around the world, youth-led climate movements have changed the way we talk about justice, urgency, and accountability. A few years ago, Greta Thunberg stood before the United Nations and demanded that world leaders need to act, her voice echoing the resolve of a generation that refuses to look away. There are many other young climate activists from the region who have organized cleanup campaigns, led advocacy for climate education, and pushed for greener cities. They are developing local innovations, solar-powered technologies, sustainable agriculture models, and digital climate storytelling. But youth are too often invited to the table only to be seen and not heard. We must go beyond tokenism. We must recognize that intergenerational equity is not just about protecting the rights of future generations, but about partnering with today's generation of young leaders. Indigenous communities around the world, including Nepal's own Tharu, Gurung, Tamang, Sherpa, and many others, have lived in harmony with nature for centuries. Their knowledge systems are not relics of the past. They are guides for our collective future. Yet these voices are marginalized in policy spaces and development programs. We must change that. Let us reimagine development is co-created with them. Let us integrate indigenous knowledge into climate adaptation strategies, into forest and watershed management, into early warning systems, and into education curricula. Nepal stands at a unique intersection of vulnerability, but also vision. We are on the front lines of climate change, with landslides, glacial lake outbursts and floods, and erratic weather patterns threatening lives and livelihoods. Yet, we are also a nation of immense resilience. Nepal has made remarkable strides in women's empowerment. Today, 41% of local government leaders are women. Women's cooperatives, community forest user groups, and mothers' groups are pillars of local governance and climate resilience. Our constitution enshrines social and gender inclusion. These are gains to be celebrated. And yet, persistent challenges remain. Women's access to land, finance, and decision-making power is still constrained. Climate finance mechanisms often fail to reach those at the grassroots. Indigenous and youth voices are underrepresented in formal planning processes. Therefore, we must contemplate on how we together can build on Nepal's role as a moral and spiritual voice, a nation that, despite its size, has shaped worldviews towards peace, harmony, and ecological balance. As a member of the UN CEDAW Committee, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, I must emphasize climate change is a human rights issue. CEDAW is a legally binding treaty and accountability framework. Ratified by 189 countries, it is a powerful tool for climate justice. In CEDAW General Recommendation 37 on the gender-related dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change, CEDAW makes clear that the impacts of climate change and disasters are deeply gendered and that failure to act with gender responsiveness constitutes a violation of women's human rights. It urges states to ensure meaningful participation of women and girls in climate-related planning, policy making and implementation. Guarantee equal access to resources, including land, finance, technology, and early warning systems. Institutionalize gender-responsive budgeting for disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. Protect women's rights before, during, and after disasters, including from violence, displacement, and exclusion. Integrate the knowledge and leadership of indigenous women into climate governance. This brings me to what I believe is the heart of the discussion today. Building an inclusive future means centering justice, dignity, and participation, not as add-ons to climate policy, but as its foundation. Distinguished delegates, the climate crisis is a crisis of inequality, and solving it requires a fundamental shift in power, policy, and participation. States, UN agencies, financial institutions, and civil society must institutionalize CEDAW General Recommendation 37 into national climate strategies, disaster plans, and environmental legislation. Ensure full and equal participation of women and girls, including indigenous, rural, and marginalized women, in climate and disaster risk reduction policy making. Fund youth and women-led climate innovation through accessible, transparent, and decentralized climate finance. Establish intergenerational mechanisms that link elders' wisdom with youth energy in long-term climate planning. Strengthen data systems to track gender-differentiated impacts of climate change and hold institutions accountable. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that we are at a crossroad. Climate change is the defining issue of our time, and how we respond to it will define who we are as a human family. Will we continue a path of exclusion and extraction, or will we choose a path of inclusion, compassion, and co-creation? Let the Sagarmatha Sambaad be a global movement, one that uplifts the voices of women, youth, and indigenous people. One that draws wisdom from the mountains and the rivers, from our elders and our children. One that invites the world to learn from Nepal's journey, a journey rooted in harmony, humility, and hope. As we contemplate our future, let us remember the mountain does not need us to survive, but we need the mountains to breathe, to balance, and to believe. Justice is not a favor, it is a right, and the earth, like all its children, deserves nothing less. We must honor that interdependence, and in doing so, we must build a future that is inclusive, equitable, and alive with possibility. I look forward to listening to the profound wisdom of our panelists here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that very powerful call to action, Vandana ji. And it is my honor to welcome the Foreign Minister, Honorable Foreign Minister Arzu Ranadioba as well. Thank you for being here, ma'am. As Vandana ji just said, we are at a turning point, and how we respond now will determine who we are and what will become of us. My first question is for Isabella. I'd like to first understand this disparity. Despite contributing minimally to emissions, why do vulnerable groups in Nepal and the Hindu Kush Himalayas keep facing the brunt of climate impacts? And has enough been done to integrate the most vulnerable into climate change policies and plans?
Thank you, thank you. And of course, the short answer is that some progress has been made, but not nearly enough. And as we know and have heard from the keynote speakers, women and vulnerable groups in Nepal and across the Hindu Kush Himalaya have contributed least to the climate crisis, and yet they face the greatest impacts because of where they live, but also because of who holds the power, who controls the resources, and whose voices are heard. And of course, this isn't just accidental, it's the result of long-term systematic exclusion from climate decision-making, from planning, and from access to finance. And I'd like to stress that this is not just at the national or regional level, but most certainly also at the international and global level. And we've heard so much already today about how women contribute to resilience, but these contributions are rarely acknowledged. And so these contributions are very often left out of climate policy and program design. So why do these gaps persist? And I think we all know that often gender and social inclusion are still treated as tick box exercises, not really yet as core principles. And of course, representation still remains painfully low. For example, at COP29, only 8 out of 77 opening speakers were women. And I think we can also acknowledge that global mechanisms have not yet gone far enough to integrate Jessie at the heart of climate policy and planning. But there has been progress in this region. So countries like Nepal, India, Bhutan, Pakistan and Bangladesh have gender provisions in their constitutions and climate policies and have ratified key global conventions. And for instance, Nepal's LAPA also requires women's participation. And gender is mentioned in the various NDC and climate change frameworks. But we still haven't really done enough to make this progress on paper translate into action on the ground, and particularly for these most affected groups. So what is now needed? We really do need action and not just token inclusion. We need to recognize that representation matters. Climate policy needs to reflect lived realities. That means we have to move beyond consulting with women and disadvantaged groups to really sharing in the leadership and the decision-making. We need to ensure that women have real seats and voices at every level, local, region, and international. And we need to shift our institutional culture. We need to equip our institutions and our staff with the tools, training, and incentives to enhance inclusion. And we really need to build Jessie expertise within our institutions, not always outsourcing and bringing in external expertise. We need to align resources with policies. So gender-responsive budgeting is very important because the finance enables the implementation of the policies. And of course, Nepal's use of Sutra to track gender-related climate expenditure is a really promising tool moving forwards. We need to invest in inclusive leadership so that we are able to make those changes in policy and practice, whilst also embedding intersectionality. Gender intersects with caste, ethnicity, and geography, and the policy needs to reflect this complexity. And then finally, we need to leverage the power of organizations such as SARC and BIMSTEC so that these platforms can also drive cross-border Jessie collaboration and lesson learning. So if gender equality is to be integrated within policies, then it must be resourced, it must be prioritized, and it must be institutionalized. And then it's time for policy to catch up with the reality in the Hindu Kush Himalaya, but also globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. There were a lot of needs. We need to do a lot of things so clearly, and I'll come to you, Patricia, for that. We need a seat at the table beyond mere tokenism, as Isabella just mentioned. How do we do that in this context now? How do we go beyond just being the side story at big events? Your views.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Sunima. Thank you for the question. Namaste. Good afternoon. And first, would like to thank the government of Nepal for this invitation, for being part of this very important conversation. And I will respond to your question building on what already Vandana and Isabella have very eloquently presented. But the short answer to the question of do we really see that women, youth, indigenous communities have a meaningful voice to contribute to the decisions that matter most and that will impact their lives right now? Unfortunately, I feel that there's still a lot to do. They could and they should have a seat at the table. And this is because if we consider the magnitude of the challenge that we have ahead of us, and since yesterday we have seen and we have heard many examples and many data on how urgent action is, really excluding this talent, the half of the population, the potential benefit that inclusion will bring is really a missed opportunity. So from that perspective, I think on the how to do this, on how to advance in this inclusion, I would like to propose, and this is a framework that also we use from UN Women, that every climate policy from our perspective has to be rooted in what we call a feminist climate justice. That might seem like a very sophisticated notion, but when I describe to you the main elements, you will see that it's very much on common sense. It has 4 main elements. One has to do with recognition of precisely what I just said around this talent, this contribution that can be made, the knowledge, the labor that both women, indigenous communities, youth, they can bring, and they bring on a daily basis, and that is also a rights aspect to it. But to be able to recognize, of course, you need data, and we've heard also in the previous panel how we oftentimes lack the data to demonstrate, although more and more we have studies that bring a very good evidence. But for instance, if we look into the SDGs, we see that less than 10% of the SDGs indicators really make this connection between gender and climate change, no? And with some of the key SDGs on water, on energy, on consumption, on oceans, having no indicator that talks about gender. So there is this gap on data. But the kind of studies that have been generated, the awareness that is being generated show the 2 angles that already Vandana has mentioned really accurately. One is the disproportionate impact that climate change has on women, the more likelihood of falling into extreme poverty, the gender-based violence also that spikes when disasters hit. For instance, the massive increase in trafficking that we see after disasters, or the increase in child marriage that we see associated to droughts. So there's increasingly more and more evidence around this, in addition to the increased care burden or care responsibility, the amount of time that women spend in drudgery because of the scarcity of those resources that usually they're in charge of collecting, no? Like water, like firewood. So we say that the climate crisis is really also a care crisis. So this impact is there, but at the same time, there are also evidences that show the very important contribution that women, indigenous community make to climate action, to finding the solutions. One, because of also the very important role that they have in the agriculture sector. Also because linked to what I just mentioned around care economy is not just this invisible job that is done on a daily basis. It also has a very important economic value that, for instance, in Nepal, the amount of work that women do in terms of care economy and paid care work, it's equivalent of 17% of the GDP, which is like even larger than the industrial sector altogether. In addition to the role, for instance, that women have as first responders in crisis. No? So their voices really, their contribution really matters, and this recognition is the essence of it. This is the first element. There's a second element that is around redistribution and the shifting the resources from these fossil fuel economies towards what we call care center and resilient systems or ecosystems, and this is very much in line with what I have just mentioned. transition. It is about investing in a comprehensive manner in climate-smart technologies that reduce this drudgery, but together with care infrastructure, together with social norms change, because we know a lot has to do with the mindsets, no? This very intangible, together with access to land, to financial inclusion. So it's really not like segmented, fragmented investments that we need to do, but really this more comprehensive investment in this redistribution. There is a third element that is around representation. I think it has been very much touched upon, and how we still see, for instance, in the higher level of COP, 1/3 of the delegations and very stagnated are women, 1/4 of those who lead the delegations. Only 2% of the delegations have gender parity, so we see a gap there, although a very positive progress, for instance, in women in leading the ministries of environment and agriculture. So really ensuring that this voice is at the table, that this voice is protected, because also being an environmental defender can have its risk, and allow this voice to demand accountability is important. And the last element that I hope we can have the chance to discuss later, the fourth element, is reparations, and this links to the element of justice, the fund for loss and damage, and how the recognition of both economic and non-economic losses linked to GVB, the increased GVB care economy, is extremely important. So just to finalize, just to say that we believe that climate justice has to be rooted in just gender justice. There cannot be one without the other. So I'll leave it there. Sunima, thank you.
Thanks very much, Patricia. Let's open up this question to a much wider demographic, and for that I'll go to Mr. Jaibal Naduvat. South Asia is home to, of course, 2.4 billion people. We all know that, a quarter of the world's population. But it's also one of the most diverse in terms of indigenous groups, castes, marginalized communities, tribes. The keynote speaker, Bandanaji, mentioned wisdom from the mountains and the trees, knowledge from the communities who have lived in harmony with nature for centuries. What is the real challenge in South Asia, particularly when it comes to integrating indigenous knowledge into the development process?
Thank you, Subnima. I think Isabella, you and my other preceding speaker referred to some very important points. First is gender, or the interests of marginalized and disadvantaged groups becoming side events at important global events. And she talked about representation as well. And Isabella used a very interesting term of it becoming tick box activities. And this is the kind of discourse that we need to dismantle, which means we really need to work hard to mainstream these conversations. In South Asia, the biggest challenge really is data, and we need to talk more about data. There is very little disaggregated data sets available when it comes to gender, and even less when it comes to marginalized groups, children, and the elderly, literally next to nothing. How can we have responsive policy making if we do not have hyperlocal disaggregated data sets first? Second is that we need to break institutional silos. Institutions are not talking to each other. If institutions do not talk to each other, how can there be a whole of government response? This is very, very important. There cannot be a whole of government response, there cannot be a whole of society response if institutional silos are not broken. The third is representation. And women's representation in climate conversations, in climate policy making, has traditionally been very little. And we need to really rework those numbers. How do we capture, not just women, the other disadvantaged groups also, how do we capture their hopes and aspirations? How do we capture their fears and anxieties while we are framing coherent policies? And that's very, very important. I mean, in vocational skills training in climate transition in South Asia, the percentage of women is less than 10%. And that's terrible. Fourth is, we have a problem of patriarchy. It's the elephant in the room, and that needs to be addressed. How do we dismantle the shackles of patriarchy? And we need to dismantle the shackles of patriarchy in two ways. One is using outreach, and the second is through being innovative, through empowering. For example, the Solar Mamas program in India empowers poor women, illiterate women, and they're trained in manufacturing, in the assembly of solar equipment. And that essentially empowers them financially. It gives them a say in their communities. And second, of course, is, like I said, the outreach. And we have seen in many of the societies, many of the communities in South Asia, that when male community leaders were engaged with, the women participation in many of the climate programs actually went up. So we need to look at outreach also. And I think these are some of the points that I would like to make here. So I talked about data, I talked about the breaking silos, and the most important point which you talked about, indigenous. We in South Asia, and perhaps in the global South, have a proclivity towards borrowed Western institutional practices and principles. We need to break free of that mentality. And that's very, very important. I mean, if you look at, I'll just give you some examples. In the 2011 Sikkim earthquake in India, the only houses, the only people who came out completely unscathed were the Lepchas. And the Lepchas used traditional methods of building their houses. Conventional houses were all destroyed, but the Lepchas came out completely unscathed. In the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the Jarawa, Sentinelese, and the Ongo tribes in the Andaman Islands of India, they have an oral tradition which says that if there is an earthquake followed by the sea receding, run for the higher ground. They were saved. And these are happening everywhere. I mean, if you look at Philippines, the Mayans have their own ways of looking at nature science, bird calls before the Mayan earthquake, the volcanic eruption happens. So we need to, how do we integrate these knowledge systems, traditional knowledge systems, into our existing resilience frameworks? That's the big question that we need to ask, and we need to be serious about this. And for that, we need to look beyond being merely clerical in our approach. We need to be inclusive, we need to be innovative. I think I'll end there.
Again, a lot of needs, things that we need to do, and I think our next panelist maybe can answer some of those questions as to how do we go about doing that. When I spoke to you a few days ago, Abdus Mia, you had said that you're the weakest link in this panel, and I actually think you're one of the strongest because you are on the front lines. You're the head of disaster management for the leading political party here. You've seen the impact of climate change, induced devastations head on, most recently in the floods in September of 2024. Can you describe your experience in such times of crisis? What happens? Is enough being done to help the most vulnerable? And how can we better integrate the youth, the communities into national climate decision-making?
Thank you. First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank the government of Nepal and actually congratulate for organizing Sagarmatha Sambaad on climate change, mountains, and future of humanity. This is very important. And we've been listening to a lot of panel speakers, experts from yesterday. It is already very clear that this agenda is a very, very important one that we cannot ignore. And as the frontliners working on disaster, a lot of time induced by the climate change, what we see is this is the time of crisis, actually. And these times of crisis deepen the inequalities in the society, which is already unequal. And let me share my personal experience, be it while working in earthquake 2015 or the recent earthquake in Jajarkot. I was actually there in the field with 1,000 volunteers, leading them, helping people build temporary shelters. You know, one thing that I realized was most of the families in the rural Nepal are led by women because their counterparts, they are in different countries for the employment and other family necessities. And when disasters strike these families, these women, leaders of their families, have to migrate along with their kids and the elderly family members that they have. And most of these women, they're not politically protected, they're not economically protected. Their social status is a lot of times compromised. And these are the real vulnerable communities that, who have to firsthand face the disaster. Can you imagine a situation where a 35 years old widow, in addition to that, if they represent Dalit community, can you imagine a situation how difficult it would be for such families to actually reestablish their home? So a lot of times we talk about, I've been listening a lot of debates here. We're talking about 100 billion money committed by the rich countries who play major roles on carbon emission and climate change. We're also talking and complaining that these funds don't reach Nepal. But my question is, the fund that is in Nepal, does it actually reach to the vulnerable communities, the real victims of the disaster? If we do a poll here, I think a lot of hands will raise that very, very significantly less amount of money will actually reach to these real victims. I don't know where money flies. So in addition to that, we've seen the women and indigenous people bear the crisis more. And we see a lot of young people who reach to these places for the support, but that is not sufficient. So we have to, the moments of crisis, these kind of moments are very, very difficult. And I've seen it with my eyes. And it is really difficult, a lot more than what we discuss in these kind of panel discussions.
So, going off on that point, developed countries, Patricia, have committed some $300 billion annually to developing nations for climate action by 2035. How can we empower the youth, the women, the children, indigenous communities of the Global South to access these funds?
Thank you, Sumima. Well, I was thinking about this question. I realized that perhaps I have to turn it around, because it seems to me that how we empower them to access is like, shouldn't be about how we design the rules of the game so that we can really access, because everything, and we can talk about many other examples, like in democracy, it's always about the rules of the game, no? And how they are designed or not to provide this kind of access. So that was my first reflection. And then, I would not repeat all the funds that have been there, because this is a quite expert audience, no? But I realized that there are perhaps some reflections, lessons learned from many years of funding from development partners, from the experience of the UN, that might apply also to the climate financial mechanism. So I just wanted to recap what would be, from my perspective, like the top lessons learned. One is that really, if in these funds we really want to target populations and we want to really address these structural inequalities, we have to make sure that, in this case, for instance, gender equality and inclusion, it's a core requirement of the funding. It cannot be an option. And for it to be a core requirement, it has to be embedded. And some of the climate funds, for instance, has it embedded, but in the requesting like gender action plans, the disaggregated indicators indicators, no, the disaggregated data that was mentioned before, the outcome tracking. But there has to be some kind of consequence if you don't follow it, no? So there has to be either incentives or penalizations if this in this design is not included, because otherwise we go back to the idea of tick the box. Secondly, I feel that it's very important also that these funds include some kind of direct access for women-led organizations, for community organizations, dedicated funding windows. And this we have seen in many other areas of work, in peace and security, in development, where these affirmative action through funding mechanisms, funding windows, can make a difference. And in the climate financing, for instance, GF, a small grants program, I think it's one of the flagship initiatives. Just to give you some data, globally, if we consider the climate official development aid, only 2% of it goes to women's organizations, no? Having said everything that we have said around their role as first responders, you know, their knowledge, their protagonism in the agricultural sector, only 2%, no? So having this affirmative action and specific mechanisms or funding windows, I think can help us moving forward. Third, I feel also we have to set some targets. And this in the UN, for instance, we've been discussing this for a very, very long time. We started, for instance, targeting that 15% of our interventions on peace and security and development, now we have had to be gender specific. No? Now we have reached to 30%. And then we realized that there would be no reason why interventions should be gender neutral, no? And we have seen a movement of many development partners that have brought it to 80% of their interventions, no? Like Canada, UK. There are several that have embraced that. Again, globally, if we look at the numbers, 3% of the global climate finance targets gender equality. So it's 3% the target that we want to keep, or we really want to raise the bar there and ensure that this is something that we commit and that we can follow through. Fourthly, I think that the kind of interventions that often we target through this funding are very, I said it before, fragmented, no? And what we really need to target is what we call gender transformative projects. That means addressing these other dimensions, like the unpaid care work, like the gender-based violence. So really encompass all the dimensions of economic empowerment, of women's economic empowerment, because we have seen, for instance, that oftentimes programs feel that because half of the beneficiaries are women, this is a gender program, no? Whilst we know that this is not the case, in fact, can be quite the opposite, no? So just, it's not about the numbers, it's really about the vision that you're supporting through and that you're funding through these mechanisms. And last but not least, we have seen how important it is to invest in capacities, not just by allowing the access to fund that you can make the difference, but by bringing training along with the financing, and also thinking more creatively. I think several times it has been mentioned the issue of innovation, of tailoring. For instance, when it comes to access to financing, we know that many women don't have access to collateral, no, when they ask for credit, no. So how we go about other mechanisms that can really be accessible to them. We have some experience using concessional loans, for instance. So blended financing, looking into these kind of innovations. But just to say that I really believe that if we want equality to be taken from a principle to a practice, money has to be there, and the way we design how money flows is where the key of success will be.
Thanks very much, Patricia. Some very good suggestions there. Isabella, you've attended several COPs before, and we've got COP 30 coming up now. How can past COP lessons, like the Lima Work Plan on gender, how do we strengthen gender inclusion? How do we ensure that yet another year or yet another event is not wasted on rhetoric?
Thank you. So, yes, I've been to several COPs over extended periods of time, and it is very easy to become a COP skeptic. Because the processes are so slow and so glacial, let's say. But actually they're important because they set critical principles that are agreed globally. So they represent international consensus. So just looking at some of the past COPs, yes, at COP 25 and 26, we agreed the Lima work program on gender and the Gender Action Plan. And these documents set out really clear targets, goals, and approaches and principles on gender. But without country enforcement, these kinds of agreements cannot go further. They remain as principles. And of course, we had the first breakthroughs on loss and damage at COP27, but many of the provisions really are not strong enough in terms of ensuring that the loss and damage mechanism targets the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged. And yet we know, we've heard already today, that these are the most affected. And of course, COP28 brought the Just Transitions work program. This does give greater visibility to disadvantaged groups, but challenges remain in operationalizing these. And COP29 saw care work finally recognized in the text. So there clearly is progress, but what does this mean for COP30? So many of you may have heard that we've got the global goal on adaptation. There is currently a process where experts are putting together the indicators on GESI for the GGA. We need to make sure that those are not dropped during the negotiations. It's critically important. Without GESI indicators, we can't track progress, as we've already heard from other speakers. Let's move from participation to putting women and disadvantaged groups into more positions of power, that they're reflected and participate and hold key positions in the negotiations, and that we do capacity build in this shift. Many women haven't had the exposure to these kinds of fora, nor have many marginalized groups. We need to ensure that they have the skills and competencies to actually be there at COP30 fighting for those GESI indicators and GGA. And we just heard that 3% of global climate funds are for women. Now let's just reflect on that. If half the world's population are women, why is it just 3% that is targeting women? I mean, that really has to go into the negotiations on the global funds. I mean, 3% is simply not enough. And that we need to also ensure that the mechanisms are there to ensure that that funding does get down to the most affected. But clearly we know that it isn't. And of course, just transitions, we need to ensure that it's the right kind of individuals and communities that are being targeted in just transitions, whether it's women workers or care systems or green jobs that address intersectional barriers. And finally, these kinds of platforms like Sagarmatha Sambaad, they're critically important. And the findings and the voices of all those that have been here over the last day and tomorrow, these need to move forward and be reflected at COP30. So I hope we'll have a coherent and consistent message that we'll all be able to take to COP30. So whilst COP30, we would love it to be a turning point. We know what the global politics is, but that shouldn't stop us really moving our ambition towards climate justice and not just climate ambition. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That really gave us a good picture of what we're looking forward to in September. Getting funding down to the most affected, that's what you mentioned, Abdusmia. When disaster strikes in Nepal, I always wonder why we here are not more prepared, why we are not perhaps forewarned. In your view, how well equipped are we here in terms of technology, early warning systems, disaster risk mitigation practices? Is there anything innovative, anything pioneering that is happening that that you can tell us about?
Are we prepared? I don't know. Yes, we are prepared if enough funds come. like one of the panelists from EC said, they have only 3% climate fund for women. How much do we have? How much climate fund do we have in terms of the global commitment? And that is far less than 3%, I guess. So we are prepared. We are ready, but we don't have money. The climate funding that is required for Nepal, that is required to solve the climate-induced disaster is not enough. Let's be very clear. And since we don't have the enough funding to battle this fight, you can imagine what kind of position we have while dealing with the times of crisis. And we're talking about gender. There's a very interesting stat here. One of the panelists was saying only women have difficult time in establishing collateral and credit. It's very amusing to see that 70% of the households are led by women today, and only 5% of women have land ownership in Nepal. In the rural part, where they have the climate vulnerabilities, in such spaces, most of the family leaders who are women do not have access to finance. Most of them don't even have bank account. We're talking about finance distribution, and we're expecting a very powerful leadership from such vulnerable groups. So the main question is, how are we going to empower them? How are we, unless we empower young people, youth, women, and the vulnerable communities in these areas, we are never going to solve this problem. And about the early warning systems, yes, limited early warning systems are installed in Nepal. That is once again due to lack of the climate fund, I suppose. And what I believe is the preparedness for the disaster is not only about technology. It is about a mindset. It is about collaboration. It is about the important organizations in this fight communicating. The collaboration, if is not done well, will never be able to solve this problem. And another important thing is, during this time of crisis, the weakest ones, the poorest ones, the societies, the communities who require the urgent help, the relief that we provide reaches to them at last. This is the real-time scenario of the disaster fight, disaster battle that we're leading today. So if we do not change it, the conversation does not have any meaning, I guess.
Thanks for that. Bandanaji, we were told that there's no questions for the keynote speaker, but I have to ask you, there is policy and there is practice. How do we ensure that these policies are actually implemented? How do we bridge this gap between policy and practice?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, policy and practice. Look at the panel discussion over here. The key words are inclusivity, participation, resources, data, dismantling patriarchy, mindset, stereotypes. If you look at that, I come to CEDAW, when you talk about policy and practice. Not because I'm a CEDAW committee member, but because the CEDAW concluding observations have been used intensely, even as a civil society activist, even before I became a member, to bring about policy changes and to make sure that these policies impact the real needed one. The reason is there are so many UN documents. But CEDAW, we have to understand, is a legally binding accountability framework where the member states, 189 countries, need to report every 4 years to the CEDAW committee, not just report, appear before the committee for a face-to-face dialogue, respond to the rigorous questions that are posed by this committee members, and then a country-specific, tailor-made roadmap of recommendations is provided to that country. It's not a blanket recommendation. It is after a rigorous review of that country, not only based on the state party report, but from shadow reports, UN city reports, UNHCR reports, that a tailor-made roadmap is provided. Many of our countries, which are poorly resourced, what happens? Isabella said, we have it very good in the papers. We have the white papers. But then it's not transformed into reality. The implementation is weak. Of course, resources always a constraint. Everywhere, even in the UN, we always say financial, resource constraint. But perhaps, coming from the CEDAW perspective, perhaps what we can say is, I always tell in the CEDAW committee, I mean, we have honorable minister here, we have parliament members, we have bureaucrats here. I can see, the joint secretary who has been engaged in the CEDAW process. When reporting to a treaty body comes, most ministries say, oh, another UN treaty body reporting. What a burden, And that is the narrative that we need to change. Because we have excellent policies, but we do not have very strong monitoring mechanisms to see whether those policies are really reaching out to the most needy. And here is a CEDAW committee of 23 world-renowned experts, hardworking, who rigorously reviews that country every 4 years and comes up with a roadmap, as I said, for the next 4 years. This is a free service. So it should be taken as an international, independent, impartial, free service. Now, how do we, maybe to some extent, I'm not saying this is the magic word and that CEDAW can do everything, but it can to a large extent, whether we, in the context of Nepal, whether we talk about the domestic violence law, the engendering constitution, it was a lot to do with the civil society activism on the basis of the CEDAW recommendations given. And there are many examples around the world. But what I'm trying to do from my own small level is, because we don't have resources, the provincial level, the local level, when they develop their annual plans, if we can look at the roadmap that is provided by the CEDAW, because all those key words, CEDAW has 16 substantive articles, it is cross-cutting across all those inclusivity, affirmative actions, everything. If only we can build the capacity, the knowledge of the provincial and local level, that when they develop their annual plans, as it is, there is going to be an annual plan, there are going to be some resources allocated for the implementation of the local plan, the provincial plan. If we can integrate these recommendations into those plans, perhaps you may not require a huge donor support or a separate donor funding. It's always welcome, of course, to add to the benefit. But perhaps that could actually align and institutionalize about how we can have plans backed with resources, commitment, and dedication to make sure that it reaches those who are very needy. And in this context, we are talking about the rural community, the vulnerable community, the indigenous, the youth. So I think, of course, there are other treaty bodies also, but when we are talking about gender, women, I think CEDAW is one of the most key treaty body. And this, as I can say, as an activist, having worked for more than 35 years, is the most powerful accountability framework. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's also why events like this one, Sagarmatha Sambaad, are so important to build solidarity, to build the cooperation that is required. Jabaji, I have one question for you before we go to the floor for questions. Just as we here in Nepal and the Global South are starting to take a leadership role in terms of this discourse and articulating our views, articulating the risks in terms of climate change, the West, or the Global North, as it were, seems to be taking a back seat on climate change. How do we create a narrative? How do we ensure that these issues are not how do we ensure that these issues stay relevant and are not sidelined? And that action is taken, real action is taken.
Sorry, technology always plays spoil. I want to see the biggest problem in narrative creation is the absence of spectacular, emotionally appealing storytelling. I mean, you had in 2009, President Nasheed of the Maldives held an underwater cabinet meeting to highlight the dangers posed by rising sea levels. That became global news because it was so emotionally appealing. It resonated so well. It resonated with each one of us. The imagery, the idea, very interesting. Then it took another 10 years for Greta Thunberg to give her face palm of I dare you at the United Nations. What happened? She was infantilized. Was it fair? She raised important issues, but she was infantilized in the global media. But the objective is not infantilization. The manifest, looking beyond the manifest is the objective. The objective is that it spurred conversations. We need more such spectacular storytelling. And that's not happening. Because what climate conversations are suffering from is narrative fatigue. It's the same old set of people talking to the same old set of people on the same old set of problems without any solutions. That leads to diminishing emotional impact. And this is something which we need to understand. The second is that climate conversations are competing in a very, very contested media landscape. You have wars and you have disasters, and you have conflicts, etc. And climate is often seen as a slow burn issue. It does not make news, and that's a huge problem. Then the mechanics of modern information consumption is very important, and our scientists and our researchers and our scholars need to understand this. Social media is the place where most of the information today is consumed. And what does social media thrive on? Social media thrives on conflict, on outrage, on novelty. Does climate fit into any of this, or are narratives being framed that way? I'm saying we don't have to be apocalyptic, because that brings its own set of problems. But we need to have spectacular storytelling. The other thing we need to understand is, when we talk about climate, when we talk about narrative creation, who builds narratives? Narratives, and this is something which we need to focus on. Narratives are built by big businesses. They play a very important role. They use big money. And big money, big businesses look at profitability. Conversations which are profitable become important conversations. If you look at, I'll give you an example. See, crude prices peaked around 2008. I mean, in 2008, it went up to $200 a barrel. So 2008 to 2014, we had it hovering around 140, 130, 150 a barrel. 2008, the prices crashed. In 2014, the prices went down. And in 2023, it was around, 2020, it went down to as much as $23 a barrel. And today, it's around $60 a barrel. A lot Western petrochem companies invested hundreds of billions of dollars between 2008 and 2014 in finding bio-based pathways to create, let's say, commodity chemicals. What happened? What happened to all those hundreds of billions of dollars? Some of those companies were also accused of green marketing, by the way. What happened after that? Once the crude prices came down, bio-based pathways like algae to oil or solism, etc., was not seen as being economically viable. So the conversations died down. The narratives went away. Now, what I think big corporations also need to understand is that a lot of science cannot happen in 5 years or 6 years, because obviously they have the stakeholders to answer to. We need to have longer gestation of 10 to 15 years. Can we have that patience? Can we bring that mindset change? I think these are some of the very important things we need to understand when we look at narrative creation. How do we create narratives that sustain through storytelling and through understanding the mechanics of modern spaces of information consumption?
Yeah, there's a lot to think about there. Thank you very much for that. Now I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, if anyone. I think there's a mic over there.
Honorable Foreign Minister, Madam Arjuna Deva, honorable panelists, and everybody here. Good afternoon. My name is Prajwal Sharma. I have two questions, one for Madam Patricia, one for Madam Bandana. Empower Women, Prosperous Nepal. That was an initiative led by the government of Nepal in collaboration with the European Union and UN Women. It's a 4-year initiative, so has there been any remarkable achievements of this initiative, or is it just another initiative that will lack its relevance in the coming years? That's a question for you. Secondly, Madam Bangarana, my mother really looks up to you. We're a great fan of you. So CEDAW is of course one of the most strongest frameworks we have. Upon its general recommendations, I believe in 2015, we have had constitutional amendments, we have had a lot of changes. But then after the COVID-19 pandemic, there's nothing in light that is really popping up. So is CEDAW losing its relevance in context of Nepal? Thank you. Prajwal Sharma signing off.
Maybe we'll hear all the questions and then answer.
Hello, awesome panelists. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Pragya Ghimere. I'm also associated with Institute of Foreign Affairs. My question is directed to Isabel Cotial from EC-Mode. Women and indigenous groups living in highlands far west and remote part of Nepal, whose main occupation happens to be subsistence farming, agriculture, and are dependent on natural resources for livelihood, face the adverse impact of climate change. How has EC-Mode taken up this issue? If you could share any adaptation and mitigation approaches, activities, programs launched towards empowering rural women, imparting adaptation skills, and making them climate resilient, we'll be very thankful. Thank you.
I think there's some questions back there.
Hello, I am Sunil Bike from Ministry of Forest and Environment. Thank you to all the panelists for the information and thoughtful, provoking discussion. I would like to ask Mr. Jayapal sir, what are the key challenges in integrating ZC principle, especially representatives, Dalit, person with disabilities, and other marginalized group into climate change related decision making at the government level? From your experience, what mechanisms have worked effectively in other countries or sector to ensure the inclusive of underrepresented group in climate and resilience planning? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. And there's one question right behind.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Jayapal Naduvat. You said that one of the problems is that we look at gender issues through a Western lens, but then you also said that our societies are patriarchal. So how do we reconcile these two to move towards gender empowerment? Thank you.
Hello.
Okay, maybe one last question and then we'll go to the answers.
I have a question to Ms. Patricia, just reflecting on what Mr. Jebel had said, that narratives only work when they're economically viable. And as you mentioned, a lot of gender issues are often seen as costly because of that integrated effect. Any law comes up, it goes as bottom down to equal education, equal access to digital rights. So the moment you talk about women infrastructure, for example, building up from that bottom level becomes very costly. Any frameworks that have helped integrate that care economy cost and make it more viable, any frameworks that have worked so far?
Okay, I think we can start answering some of those questions. Would you like to start, Bandana?
Thank you. We have the UN resident coordinator also here, Hannah Singer, so your voices are being heard by the key entities as well. Well, thank you so much, young gentlemen, for your question. In terms of COVID, I think it was a global challenge. So the impact was worldwide, you know that. CEDAW was also impacted in terms that we were not able to meet physically and review the countries. So some of the backlogs have been great. There's a long list of countries that needs to be reviewed now. And with the present resource constraint, particularly with the global scenario now, even as sessions may not take place regularly, it might be diminished. So that's the impact. But I wanted to say that the COVID itself, during the COVID time, in fact, I was the key drafter for the COVID guidance note of CEDAW. So which entails that countries, when they report to CEDAW, need to report on their gender responsive response programs post-COVID. So that's an accountability thing, just about COVID. Another question that you said, is CEDAW losing its relevance? Not at all. It's that people are being disengaged, not interested, not knowing. This is just a technical word, CEDAW, what it is. I really urge everyone here to go through the Google and look at CEDAW. Nepal just reported. It appeared before the CEDAW. Set of, again, I said, a specific roadmap recommendations to Nepal to be implemented for the next 4 years. So, it hasn't lost its relevance. It's how we use the CEDAW process and procedure UN and other entities look at the roadmap and work with the government to come up with a common agenda. How do civil society use those recommendations to intensify their advocacy? Rights law that came in Nepal in 2018, which your Honorable Minister is very much engaged in that Safe Motherhood program as well as the chair. That came about, one of the recommendations was strongly from the CEDAW committee. The law. But it is a combination of the recommendation, the advocacy from civil society, the UN entities, the government, that brings about these changes. So CEDAW will never lose its relevance. It's, as I said, a legally, every 189 states are obligated to report every 4 years. So please use it as much as you can.
Thanks, Patricia. Would you like to answer some of the...
Yes, I think so. Thank you so much. There was a very relevant question around how Empower Women Prospers Nepal. That is, in fact, indeed a program led by the government of Nepal with the support with our different mandates. So I'll be very keen to provide you more details, but just to say that, in fact, yes, a lot of progress has been done at 3 levels, federal, provincial, and local level, working in 32 palikas. And this, in fact, is flagship because it can be an example of what I mentioned before around gender transformative. It addresses the mindset, the social norms, the opportunities, the access to services and to real and it's very ambitious, it's very comprehensive, but I will be very happy to provide you more details on that because I think it's a flagship initiative. And on the very interesting question on the cost of investing in gender equality, no? And I think it's very, when we start always our technical assistance with the local governments to propose using the tool of gender responsive budgeting, always the reaction is kind of like, okay, but I have to find money that I don't have. And in fact, it's not about resources that you already have for greatest or for effectiveness and for sustainability. We believe that without investing in gender equality, you just cannot make sure that or that your responses are going to be sustainable. And in fact, certain agendas, like the care economy agenda, we know that there is a very strong case for increased job creation. So it's an investment, it's not a cost. Question to ask and how we reverse it, I think, is going to be the key to answer that.
Isabella, I think there was a question for you as well, if you'd like to answer.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Clarify. So ICIMOD is a knowledge organization, and so our role is very to build the understanding and the capacity of how to respond to these challenges. So to trial and test solutions so that other organizations, institutions, our government partners, UN agencies can take them up. So we're very, very conscious of the crisis in the mountain regions. We're already hitting 1.5. Many of the solutions that have been developed in the past were attuned and developed for a 1 degree or less world. So we're very conscious of innovation of what actually works in a 1.5 warm world. So some examples of what we've been working on. So mountain springs are communities. They are the main source of water, but 30% or more have dried out over the last decades. So we're working on various tools and technologies alongside our Bangladesh on how we can revive these springs. So there are tools, there are technologies that can help revive the springs and the water. We've also been looking at high altitude natural herbs and products could be taken to market. The mountains are extraordinarily rich. Yes, they are changing, but how can easy, but it's what we're working on. We've also been looking at the pastoralists and how we can help. This is a rapidly changing livelihood economy, and yet pastoralists high altitude ecosystems. So we're looking at how we can bring back some of the traditional practices of burning, ensure that that pasture, those grasses, are maintained and remain viable. We're also now beginning to embark on looking at mountain settlements. Many mountain communities are moving into urban areas. So we're looking at particularly mountain settlements and how we can involve things like solid waste management and waste management. And of course, instituting community-based early warning systems. So again, all these are solutions we're promoting, but various implementing partners in order to scale these. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabalji. If you would like to answer some of the questions that were posed to you. I think there were.
So, I think the first question is, how do we make decision-making more representative? Was that the question? Yeah? That's the question. The thing is that in our way from ad hocism and tokenism to institutionalization, which means that we also need, and this is very, very important, we need to decolonize our minds. And mark my words. The idea of a lot of the way vulnerable communities are defined, etc., are very colonial. We need to find our own taxonomies, right? And we need to institutionalize those, which means that we need to find our own ways, which also calls into question some very uncomfortable realities. Our study tours going to Europe and America should actually go to our villages. That is where our learnings are. And look at lessons from within. There is no greater success, there is no greater pathway to success than that. I think coming to the second, so the answer is institutionalization, and the second is how do we break patriarchy, and so I think that was the second question that had come from somewhere. The way to break patriarchy is to empower. We need a program which I talked about, which empowers women by making them financially independent within their communities, by helping build solar equipment, assemble solar equipment, gives them money in their hands, also gives them decision-making powers. Because community leaders or community leaders who are typically and traditionally male need to be engaged with. I come from a patriarchal community and my surname is, from a patriarchal community and my surname is my mother's surname, and our women are very, very empowered, and, and we also see a very typical. Can we look at some of these systems that exist within our communities to address patriarchy? But it will require a huge policy intervention. For example, in many parts of Africa, in their name, they have to register it in the man's name. So some of these policy frameworks also need to be really looked at. Empowerment is one thing. And like I said, negotiating, engaging with community leaders. You engage them, don't ram a shotgun approach. It should be an approach where you engage with them. If you engage with them, you will see positive results. In communities in Southern Asia, in many spaces in Southern Asia, women are disadvantaged also because of without the men folk. They cannot, they wear clothing which may inhibit their ability to escape spaces when faced with a disaster. These are important questions that we need to answer. And we need to be honest. I think those were the two questions posed to me.
I think so. I think so. There was no question for you of this meeting, but I have a question for you because we have a little bit of time. I think we have. We've heard all these discussions over the past 2 days with the Sagarmatha Sambaad, and certain expectations, I'm sure. And as a youth leader of Nepal, what do you make of energy as well? There's policy and there's practice. How do we ensure that everything that was discussed here, that there's action, like something happens after this?
That's a great question, actually.
What are your hopes?
Already lies in the organizing of Sagarmatha Sambaad itself, because KP Sharma Oli initiated this understanding the climate injustice, understanding the vulnerability that millions of Nepali people have to face for years. What I see is our lobby, our negotiation in the global stage are not enough, and that is why there is the need of organizing such. I believe that Nepal, the government of Nepal is very serious about raising the climate issues in the global stage. Not been enough. We definitely expect that we've raised a good voice, organizing this, inviting world the countries that actually need to pay a lot of money. The leaders are not here. That could be a question of critic, but this is very by government of Nepal, organizing Sagarmatha Sambaad and inviting world leaders, the necessary stakeholders here, and reinstating the issue of climate. This is not the end. The negotiation, the lobby, the up in the world stage. Will carry on, and we're looking positively for upcoming COP30.
Yeah, it's something you mentioned to me on the phone, climate crisis, climate change is more of a, in your words, you told me, an NGO or a INGO issue
Exactly.
it is not taken seriously. And
Yeah.
so I think we're...
In Nepal, everybody knows that the issue of change and the issue of disaster has always been taken care by the political organizations, political parties are only busy the political issues, but these kind of initiatives have sort of reaffirmed. This is an example that political parties and governments are also taking this issue seriously and making their actual political agenda, and this is a thing to be.
Thank you all. And as we conclude this very interesting, very powerful conversation, one truth stands clear, and it is those closest to the climate crisis actually have some of the solutions here as well. Our job is to act so that climate policy not only becomes sustainable, but is just. And I think that's what I have to say before I hand over to the organizers, but if there's anything else that we've missed, and if you have some closing remarks. Yeah, we're just in, yes.
We thank you, Sumnima. Actually, this session, I think we are honored to have a national identity, but a global celebrity, a journalist for CNN, who's moderating the session. So I just wanted to thank
you. Very kind of you, thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists, our keynote contribution. In this session, we explored how the climate crisis hits women and young people the hardest. This session also reminded us that real climate solutions need both data and lived experience. Now, we are a little late behind our schedule, so we would like to present a small token of appreciation to our moderator, keynote speaker, and panelists as a gesture of appreciation for your time, contribution. Now invite Honorable Dr. Arju Rana Deuba to the stage to do the honors, please. I'd like to accept the token of appreciation. Mr. Abdus Mia, please stay forward to receive the token of appreciation. I also request Mr. Jaybal Naduvad to step forward to Now I'd like to request Ms. Patricia Fernandez to step forward to accept the token of appreciation. Ms. Isabella Cozelli, we'd like to invite you to step forward to receive the token of appreciation. First, I'd like to request Ms. Sumnima to step forward to receive the token of appreciation. A group photo session, please. Once again, thank you to all our wonderful speakers and panelists. As we're running a little bit late behind the time, so we'll have a